Hi, folks. My name's Zach. I'm a lawyer with Eco-Justice. I'm Plains Cree. My people are the Fort people from Fort Carlton area, Saskatchewan. But I was born in Calgary, so I'm happy to be here in Treaty 6 territory, my home territory. So thanks for having me, and I apologize for not submitting my bio on time. So.
Thank you, Zach. I'm also going to keep my mask on. Can people hear me? Fine? Yeah, cool. Can people see me if I sit down? Not really? Maybe? No. All right. You can sit. I'm going to start by sort of doing some grounding to understand why the work that Eco-Justice undertook in the research is so important to understanding the context to how the governments operate in relation to Indigenous rights. So I always like to start things by grounding in who I am as an Indigenous woman. And this is a picture of some moccasins that were my grandfather's or my Seta's, Baba or Isidore Deranger. And I'm wearing them in the red earths of the Northern Territory in Australia, where I met with the First Nations or the Indigenous peoples in Australia that were fighting massive fracking, where their entire territory was leased out to multinational corporations. And it was just like being home, but in another place where water was one of the most critical places. And I took with me not only the stories of my community, but I literally wore the moccasins of my grandfather on the ground. Next slide. So I come from the Athabasca Chipewyan First Nation, or the Kaital, Kaital Dene Sotlene people. And Kaitale, what it means is people of the willow. And it's a reference to the Athabasca Delta, where we come from. And this is a big part of our identity, our culture of who we are. And Dene, or Dene Sotlene, means people of the land. And so when we talk about our identities and who we are, they're intrinsically connected to the places that we come from. And Chief Alan Adam once said, if they destroy the Delta, they destroy the Peace Athabasca Delta with the ongoing expansion of the Alberta tar sands, then who are we? We can no longer be the Kaitale Dene Sotlene because there will be no more Kaitale. And so we understand that this deep relationship and our identities as Indigenous peoples, it's intrinsically linked to these places that have supported our community since time immemorial. And this is a really critical component to our identities and where we come from. As a child, I was raised in the bush, living off of the land, hauling water from the river systems so that we could cook and clean. And I learned that the lands and the territories, not just the four-legged and the winged ones and the ones that swim, but everything from the rocks to the trees to the grasses to the plants, the medicines, and all of our relations were intrinsically a part of who we are, and that we needed to respect and honor everything that we lived in harmony with. And this ideology continues to be permeated in our lives, in the way that we live our day-to-day lives in our region. And the top corner picture, that's above view of Fort Chipewyan, and that's on the shores of Lake Athabasca. But we are led to believe that the country that we call Canada was developed and built off of these treaty agreements, these partnerships, this symbol that we came together and we shook hands and everything is all great. But the reality is when we start to look at what it means to have treaty agreements, that there are some really big problems that have happened in Canadian history. So we often think of Canada through these numbered treaty systems. You know, the numbered treaties 1 through 11. We also have modern day treaties, and we also have pre-Confederation treaties. And these treaties set the framework for how the land would be taken up in this country. The Royal Proclamation of 1763 said no land would be taken up without a treaty. And this is really important because we have to understand that colonization and the Canadian history does not begin in 1763, does not begin with the signing of the first treaties in the late 1800s. It actually begins hundreds of years before, during pre-contact. and that these treaties were signed under extreme duress by many of our communities that had already experienced first wave colonization. They'd already experienced massive disease, tactics of assimilation. The French and the British were fighting over this land. And to the south, in what is now the lower 48 and so-called United States, there was massive American Indian wars going on. And so these treaties were told, you can have it this way, or you can have it the way they're doing it down there. They literally threatened and sort of persuaded us to sign these agreements, and we applaud them because they did. They saved us from the American Indian Wars. But the reality is that this is a system that was created for our people to accept really bare minimums of good faith agreements with governments that continue to be violated to this day. Next slide. And this is really important when it comes to the context of the cultures and our identities as Indigenous peoples and our connections to the land. A lot of people think of like, well, those cultures are things of the past. We don't live in teepees and communicate with smoke signals anymore. Why do you want to go back to that, right? And the reality is that particularly in northern rural communities like mine, traditional food sources are a really, really important part of our lives, not just culturally, but economically. They actually offset the cost of living. And so having clean, healthy environments is not about having access to parks that we can go enjoy some recreational activities and do sport hunting. It's critical to our survival as peoples, not just our cultural survival, but our actual intrinsic survival. So when you are degrading the ecosystems that we live in, you are degrading the quality of life for our communities. And it's really important to understand that our communities have these deep relationships, but it's not just a relationship that we have, it is developing these deeply regarded, in modern day, Indigenous knowledge systems. And this is a type of science. So if we look at what science is and the definition of science, it is the idea of observation, observing and interacting and experimenting with things. Indigenous knowledge systems have millennia of knowledge to draw on that was passed down intergenerationally, and it makes us some of the best observers and some of the best scientists, ecologists, hydrologists, conservationists, so on and so forth. And what's really important to understand that is Indigenous lands and territories the world over, that we have protected and created safeguards for land rights, Indigenous livelihoods, biodiversity, and this has amounted to over 312 billion tons of carbon that remain in the ground, sequestered, because we have protected those lands and territories because of their critical relationships to who we are as Dene, Cree, Ojibwe, Haudenosaunee, Hawaiian, go on, so on and so forth the world over. And this is really important to understand. Because when we look at so-called Canada, governments are starting to go, oh great, we gotta start fixing stuff. Right now in Montreal, world leaders are talking about the Convention on Biological Diversity and how we safeguard the environment because they look at it as carbon sinks. They look at it as something that can be bought and sold and traded to protect the environment. But we have to understand that these carbon sinks are really critical to the survival not only of our communities as Indigenous peoples, but the world over. And we must be doing more than looking at them as something separate from us, but we have to restore the relationships that we've lost through colonization. We have to do that by recognizing that these are not just carbon sinks and forests, but these are the homelands of Indigenous peoples. We just stop thinking of provinces and treaty territory numbered areas, but the relationships and the Indigenous knowledge systems that have been passed down by all of the different Indigenous nations that call this place home. But what has actually happened in this country is that Indigenous lands and territories have been degraded. We saw that earlier map of the treaty territory that we but kids are learning about in school as if this is what we have. I come from Treaty 8. It's the largest treaty territory in the country. And yet we remain disempowered because we don't have control over our lands and territories. What we have control of are these little tiny dots. 0.2% of the land mass of Canada is under the control of Indigenous peoples, and the other 99.8% is considered Crown land. That is a violation of treaty that has further put us into a place of duress. We have no economic control over our lands and territories, and we have to fight tooth and nail to have any kind of say in the resource extraction projects, capitalism, economic systems, and policies that are being developed to utilize our own lands and territories. These are violations, and these systems continue to put our communities into states of poverty, economic crises, and the list goes on and on and on. So essentially, Canada is a country built off of stolen land. I'm going to take this mask off. And Canada is a celebration of systems of white supremacy, colonial violence, ongoing land theft, and Indigenous genocide. We've heard some of the presentations already today that explain some of the things that we're experiencing right now in this world that are a continuation of the ongoing colonial projects. And it's really important when we talk about protecting our lands and territories to understand what this really means. What does it actually look like when we talk about the degradation of our lands and territories, which equates the degradation of our cultures and lifeways as Indigenous peoples? This is a map of the anthropogenic footprint, meaning human activity. This is what we have seen in Canada. I can't remember what year this was right now. And you can see a lot of it is in the highly dense red areas are where we see a lot of major city centers and mass populations, but Alberta looks a little different, right? We're not a highly densely populated province, so what is driving the anthropogenic footprint in the province? Can people see this? It's the industrial sector. A sector that, again, our communities, despite having the largest treaty territory, Treaty 6, or Treaty 8, Treaty 6, Treaty 7, we have not, for the majority of the development of this industrial sector, had a hand in developing and advancing these sectors. These sectors were developed long before we were even given the rights to participate in this. Before we were even given the rights to vote, some of these sectors had been well on their way into development, including the Alberta tar sands, which began operation in the 60s. We did not get the right to vote until 1960. So what happens? What happens when our lands and territories are put into the hands of people whose ideological perspectives see them as man's dominion over nature, as if the land was given to man simply to reap its bounties? What happens when colonists come here and they think that terra nullius, there's nothing here, it is ours to take, doctrine of discovery, it is ours, where they dehumanized and demonized Indigenous ideologies and perspectives? We can say things like this are okay. We say things like the Alberta tar sands are great for the economy, great for the people. This is we're going to create energy for our communities. Do you know what happens? My community, the Athabasca Chipewyan First Nation, 180 kilometers downstream from this development, we still primarily have diesel to generate our homes. We don't reap the bounties of this energy enterprise that's being developed. Instead of being partners in this, we are told you can take what you get through impact benefit agreements, which we had to take the government to court for in order to even have any kind of benefit for. The Mikisew versus the Crown, I believe it's 2007, they fought in order for us to have more say in the development of these projects, because prior to that, just like we heard about the dumping in Navajo territories and other communities, this very project breached millions and millions and millions of liters of affluent water into the river system, and our community wasn't notified for 9 months. Go back to what I said at the beginning. As a child, we used to haul the water from our river systems to cook and drink and clean ourselves. There were still people in my community at that time that were still drinking directly from the river system. That has changed fundamentally because when we learned that these corporations were just disregarding and disrespecting our water systems to that point, we started to also see in that same time frame increases of cancer, autoimmune diseases, respiratory illnesses, so on and so forth, growths and deformities in our food systems. And we fundamentally had to shift. But instead of actually stopping these projects like we've asked for, where we have exhausted judicial, regulatory, and public avenues to try to get them to stop, they continue. So much so that right now the expansion of the Alberta tar sands is at an all-time high, and the corporations that are building there are making record-breaking profits. And what we get are impact benefit agreements. Our communities are told, take this or take nothing at all, because these projects are going to move forward with or without you. And so we are seeing that there is this continuation of the very beginning of colonization, of putting our communities into states of duress and crisis in order for us to accept the status quo that this is okay. Next slide. This is my favorite banner I ever painted. So for me, I'm like, WTF, why is this okay? Why are we accepting the status quo that this is okay? Not just for my community, but this story is a narrative that we hear the world over with Indigenous peoples. I just came back from a very large international climate conference in Egypt, the UNFCCC COP27. You don't really need to know that much about it, but it's a big conference. Go to the next slide. And we can see that the colonial European empires exist all over the world. And this is a story that many Indigenous peoples are facing, whether it's tar sands or fracking or just traditional sweet crude oil, logging industries, so on and so forth. Industrial development and extraction of seeing the land as something that we can take for our benefit as opposed to the relationships we have as Indigenous peoples destroys those relationships and allows people to sanction these types of projects. Go back. And it's really important to understand that as Indigenous peoples, our fight, when we stand up and when we oppose these projects and we oppose the status quo of ongoing colonialism, we are doing it for everyone, for all of our Indigenous brothers and sisters. And we only represent about 5% of the global population, or 500 million people worldwide, but we represent over 5,000 distinct language groups, governance, education systems, and ways of being in over 90 countries. And we occupy and use between 22 to 64%, it's a huge debate, that's why I put both those numbers up there, on the land surface of the whole globe. In relation to urban centers, guess how much urban centers take up across the whole planet? Anyone? Not. It's low. It's about 3 to 4%. 3 to 4%. That's what is used by urban centers. Whereas Indigenous peoples, in order to utilize our lifeways, and bring forward our culture and identity, we need massive amounts of land surface. That has ultimately resulted in our communities fighting for the preservation and safeguarding of 80% of the world's biodiversity is within Indigenous lands and territories. That is not some sort of coincidence. That is because we see these places as intrinsic to who we are, and that these places need to be healthy and abundance and growing and being in relationship with us in order to continue our Indigenous knowledge systems, our governance practices, our economies. Everything is hinged upon our ecosystems and the places that we come from being healthy. The last piece, which is also an interesting fact, is that 85% of the world's protected and conservation areas are also within or adjacent to. So some of these biodiverse regions are not protected zones. They're just areas that Indigenous peoples have been fighting to protect. But we're seeing this uptake in Indigenous peoples advancing for the protection and preservation through conservation movements. We see this in my own territory with the Wood Buffalo National Park and the UNESCO World Heritage Site, and we see this over and over and over again. But again, I want you to think about as I pass off to Zach is that our communities, through a history of ongoing colonization, have constantly been put into states where we're told that our lifeways are backwards, antiquated, we lack innovation, despite the fact that we invented aspirin or the syringe or the baby bottle nipple or rubber and so on, these suspension bridges. I don't know if you all know this, but these are all Indigenous inventions. These are all Indigenous inventions that have been co-opted by settler society, and then they turned them into commodities and market them to the world and give us no credit. And we continue to see this co-optation of Indigenous ideologies over and over again, and it's a very dangerous game. And we are also seeing how these governments are co-opting and saying that when we sign an impact benefit agreement, therefore we are in partnership with the government, and that's simply not true. So I'm going to pass it to Zach, who's going to talk a little bit about the research that we did.
Thanks so much, Eriel. Yeah, go ahead and clap, everybody. That's and that's definitely clapping for Eriel and not me. That's fine by me. So what I'll do is I'll walk you through a little bit of the details on the research that EcoJustice has done with Indigenous climate action, and I'll throw out some general numbers as well to begin with, just to sort of bring the context that Eriel's been talking about into a little bit more sort of specific clarity. And then I'd like to offer just a few of my own reflections on possibly what these numbers might be illustrating, and maybe some hopeful words of encouragement to finish with. So to begin with, I'll give you the lawyerly answer as to how much does Canada spend fighting Indigenous peoples. The answer being it depends. It depends on how we look at the question, how we frame what do we mean by fighting Indigenous peoples. So I mean, when you look at the sheer extent and the sort of fundamental nature of the conflict between the colonial system and Indigenous peoples, the kind of spending done by the colonial system that at its core is in opposition to Indigenous peoples, well, it's kind of all of the spending. If you think about it, the system is essentially set up to facilitate dispossessing Indigenous peoples. And so every dollar that's spent, in a way, could be considered as being put towards fighting Indigenous peoples. So that's one way to look at it. In a lot of ways, that's how I look at it. But in terms of specific dollar figures, if we look at CERNAC alone, that's Crown Indigenous Relations. Over the past, I guess, however many years this Trudeau government has been in power, they've spent like close to $350 million on legal fees alone in court against Indigenous peoples, and over 100 million, something like 120 or 150 in the past year alone. And so it's great to see announcements coming out of this meeting happening in Montreal, that the feds are interested in spending many millions of dollars on working with Indigenous communities. But at the same time, they're talking out both sides of their mouth, because they're going to be shelling out hundreds of millions of dollars to their lawyers to defend them against Indigenous peoples and to actively fight Indigenous communities in court. So that's just a picture of CERNAC, which is one ministry within the government of Canada. And relatively speaking, CERNAC doesn't actually do that much. Some of the other ministries that actually throw a lot more money around in ways that have bigger impacts on Indigenous communities. I'm thinking Environment Canada, Fisheries, I mean, the list goes on and on, are throwing millions and millions and millions of dollars every year into their legal budgets alone, in large part to fight First Nations and Indigenous communities. So that is a pretty ugly picture, and we'll explore a little bit what that kind of means. What I'll do is I'll also talk to you about the report that we've done up for Indigenous climate action. So myself and a couple of colleagues at EcoJustice had a look at specifically, so you'll recall, and remember, it's not just the feds spending all this money. There's a whole bunch of provinces in this country, and they spend a lot of money as well fighting Indigenous communities. And so we had a look at, specifically in response to the so-called public inquiry into anti-Alberta activities that the Kenney government in its infinite wisdom thought would be a good idea. So they put $3.5 million into this report, this public inquiry, which, I mean, for a lot of reasons, it wasn't public, it wasn't really an inquiry, and it didn't really look at anti-Alberta activities. So it was kind of just a big nothing. But one of the interesting comments that they made, which I think plays into the sort of narrative that Eriel was discussing, that, like, the comment was Indigenous opposition to things like oil and gas development. And these would be the kinds of things that would turn into the sorts of legal battles that either the feds or the province would be spending all these millions of dollars, defending against. They said in this report that Indigenous opposition was a quote-unquote vocal minority, and that it was a small group of very opinionated, very environmentally oriented people in a couple of communities that would be raising this opposition, whereas the vast majority of First Nations, in their view, were in favor of development and were the natural allies of the oil and gas industry in facilitating the destruction of the territory. So that obviously raises a lot of interesting questions, because right off the bat, and I think Eriel can attest to this as well, that doesn't make any sense. That doesn't line up with the lived experience of so many people who have been standing up against the wanton extraction and development on their territories at every stage for decades and decades. So we figured we ought to have a look at that and see what was going on. And so what we did, we looked at the Alberta Energy Regulator. We looked at court decisions. We looked at just other sort of publicly, very, very obvious instances where First Nations or other Indigenous groups, community organizations, etc., were voicing some kind of opposition to an oil sands development. And so that could include, filing statements of concern to the Alberta Energy Regulator, launching actual court cases, just being in the media about it, that sort of thing. And what we found was in very stark contrast to what the Alberta inquiry was raising. So what we found was, rather than being a vocal minority, many, many, many Indigenous communities in one way or another have actively and continuously voiced their opposition and articulated their concerns and their desire to not be pushed around when it comes to oil and gas development on their territories. So in our little search alone, we found 68 different First Nations alone who voiced an opposition. That doesn't feel like a minority to me. We also had over 130 separate instances where a community was voicing opposition. And this is over the past, I'd say, our research extended into the past 30 years at least. And so what we found, like I say, is a sustained, very direct and open opposition voiced by many communities in many ways about many projects. So the quote-unquote inquiry was flat out wrong. And they spent $3.5 million on this inquiry. Now, my colleagues and I mean, we do great work, but like for us, it was pretty easy to find this information that we found. It's all publicly available information. Most of it you can Google search. And we found, and it only took us, I don't know, a few months to put this together. And that inquiry lasted for, I don't know how many, it was two years, something like that, 2-3 years. It went on and on and on, and they asked for extensions and blah, blah, blah. They relied on a couple of statements, particularly from I think it's called the Indian Resource Council, which purports to represent First Nations in Alberta and beyond, I think, with oil and gas interests in their territory. But they relied on a couple of comments from a couple of people from there and almost nothing else for their research. And in a fraction of the time and for a fraction of the cost, in fact, it was pretty much free to find the information that we found. We found the exact opposite of what they spent millions and millions and millions of dollars trying to feed the public. In terms of their narrative. So I realize that that's it's a bit off topic because it's a Alberta focused inquiry and an Alberta focused report that we did. But I think that the image that it paints is pretty clear. The conflict and the level of disagreement over what ought to be done is significant, and Indigenous communities obviously have and continue to articulate at every opportunity their opposition to especially not having a say in what's done on their lands. And what that creates, which kind of brings us back a little bit more to the funding numbers, like for the feds, for instance. What we get is, I think, a country, a government that in many ways is essentially an enabler or facilitator, and is in many ways, and trigger warning here, is in many ways simply an abusive partner in an abusive relationship. And so what we see from, the Kenney government in their inquiry is this sort of gaslighting exercise, which is, oh, well, First Nations are on board with us destroying their lands. See, here's this select couple of comments from somebody who's in our pocket. And we're not going to talk to anybody else. But that's supposed to count as, the total truth of the matter. So I think that's what we're seeing. And when you see these figures, like Cernak alone, spending, $350 million over the past just a few years. What we have, I think, is a country and a government, a federal government, and provincial governments that are essentially desperately clinging on to the kind of status quo that Eriel has highlighted. They are clinging and pouring money into defending against the swell of opposition that they get, because essentially they've set themselves in a tough position. They've decided, okay, we want a country that facilitates resource extraction because that's what we do. We're a colonial country, and we're going to do that at the expense of First Nations. And we're going to have to first, pour all these millions of dollars into, over the years, things like residential schools, etc. But now in more recent times, we also have to pour money into legal defense to sort of navigate the huge rift that they have created by having this colonial system that just doesn't match the reality of what it means to be in these lands. And so they're essentially, like I say, they're desperately clinging. They're throwing all this money into it, and they are gaslighting us into thinking that they're also spending money on, all these other reconciliation activities. But really, when you look at the numbers and you look at the amount of opposition that they get, when it walks like a duck, it talks like a duck, you should probably keep the receipt. How's that for a joke? So it leaves me to wonder, okay, so we see this gaslighting and this abusive behavior from an abuser. I think that's how we can safely characterize the colonial state. We see that, and we see the amount of money that they're willing to pour into fighting Indigenous causes to prop themselves up. And I what I don't want to do is be doom and gloom on you. I would like to leave you with maybe some ways that I think about it on a day-to-day basis that may or may not help you. And I mean, I'm happy to discuss further as we move forward. But so what I see when I see a federal government that's willing to spend all these hundreds of millions, desperately clinging on to the status quo and this very shaky position that they've put themselves in, where they don't really have any good options. It's either fight First Nations or, start asking some fundamental questions about the nature of their own sovereignty and their own system. And, those are tough questions, even for an abuser to ask themselves. Yeah. So now that they're in that position, their solution so far has been to litigate and defend against litigation and signal, some of these reconciliatory things, which are, it's good. But at the same time, they're trying to keep their sinking ship afloat. That's what's happening here. And they will continue to try that because I believe that, as an abusive thing, they're deeply, deeply uncreative and unimaginative. It's essentially parasitic. And it's hard to say that about, what is supposed to be your own country. But when your own country is a parasite, you might as well point that out. So when you see the lack of creativity of the parasite, well, that kind of gives us the answer for ourselves in a way too. The parasite and the abuser does not want us to be able to imagine a future without them controlling everything. They want us to believe that essentially treaties are done, it's all the land's all gone, we've destroyed it all, and you have to kind of deal with us piecemeal by litigation, that sort of thing. Because they themselves can't imagine a future without their pattern of behavior. They cannot imagine it, and they refuse to imagine it. And so that is where the power really lies. There's a reason that they don't want us to be doing that and spending all this money trying to make that happen. So what I think we ought to do day to day in the work that we do in all fields and at all times in your life is imagine a future. Imagine a future and protect your imagination, your creativity. Defend it. Because, the parasite will fight when cornered. And so we have to be prepared to defend ourselves in that way as well. I think about I'll tell you a little bit about my ancestors. So seven generations or so ago, a whole bunch of my uncles were treaty signatories. They actually were some of the chiefs that signed Treaty 6. Chief Atagago, Chief Poundmaker, to name a few. These were all my uncles. And so they negotiated with these representatives of the Queen, which in those times, that was a big deal. That meant a lot. When you're talking to the representative of the Queen, this is a person with, a deep, actual spiritual layer of power, at least from the European perspective. And so, these were serious, solemn negotiations that were going on. And there's actually interesting evidence from Treaty 6 that these treaty commissioners, these representatives of the Crown, were actually somewhat sympathetic to a degree, and they actually were attempting to engage with the Indigenous perspectives and worldviews that were, on the table, which is kind of unique in the treaty, like the numbered treaties, especially in the later ones. The understanding of Indigenous worldviews was it just wasn't there. But in this case, there was at least an attempt. And so I think about my ancestors negotiating this treaty in a really tough spot. People were starving. The buffalo were just about gone. And, they got some farming implements out of the deal, I think. I'm still waiting for mine. Yeah, I'm not bitter. Just a shovel. Like, that's all. No. Anyways, thinking about my ancestors, like they when they were signing that treaty, they were thinking, as people have said today, they were thinking 7 generations ahead, at least. So they were thinking of my generation. They were thinking of me. And I have to think about, people 7 generations from now from me, who I'll never meet. And so they were thinking about me. They signed the treaty. Are we doing good for 5 minutes? Okay. I'm just about done. I won't ramble too much longer. So they signed the treaty. They were thinking about me. And then the powers that be, this colonial parasite, this thing, tried again to smash them, to wipe them out, wipe out their culture, wipe out their language, wipe out their understanding, and wipe out their ability to articulate their opposition. Same kind of thing that we see today with all these millions of dollars that the feds are spending. And in the case of Poundmaker, my uncle, the government actually sent troops during this was the second Eriel resistance. And so Canadian troops actually fired at my family. So like my family, and I think a lot of the families in this room, are no stranger to fighting and being fought by this parasite. No strangers at all. And so, bringing that into now, that's why I say, like, I don't want this to be doom and gloom, because what has been going on and what continues to go on and why they need to continue to spend these millions and millions of dollars, it's because Canadian laws it's interesting because it is meant to be like a static, set in stone thing, but at the same time it's really not. In fact, in the English legal tradition, like the idea of the common law, the law, at least settler law, is an evolving thing. And importantly, it is contested at all stages. And so, contest it. These people have to spend millions and millions of dollars fighting. Let's make them spend more. In the interest of time, I will hand the mic off to whoever needs it.
Jamie, could you go through some slides? On that point, I want to show you why it matters. Keep going. This is a bunch of other stuff. You don't need to know all this stuff. This is a big, long lecture that I would give otherwise. Keep going. Oh my God, Eriel, you're so long-winded. Right there, stop, go back. One more. Where is it? Keep going, back. No, keep going forward. You missed it. 1, 2, 3, 4. Next one. There, this one. Why is it so important? This is really, 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 really important to understand. So ICA, Indigenous Climate Action, partnered with Oil Change International Indigenous Environmental Network, which is based out of the U.S. And we looked at how Indigenous land defense actually equals climate mitigation. So that stat, 80% of the world's biodiversity is Indigenous lands and territories. When we are fighting these projects, we're not just fighting to fight so government spends their money. We're fighting to protect the earth for everybody, for all future generations. And Indigenous land defense alone, and this is not an exhaustive report, just like the eco-justice report is not exhaustive, it is roughly 1.8 billion tons of carbon has been left in the ground because of Indigenous opposition to resource extraction, whether that's in the Bakken oil fields or in the Alberta tar sands or wherever it is. So when we fight, we are not just fighting for our communities, we're fighting for the 7 generations ahead to have a livable planet, to have drinkable water, to be able to survive in the future. And it is really important because our ideas and Indigenous-led solutions, Indigenous laws and governance are critical because, as Zach stated, colonial societies lack creativity, which is so funny because they said that we lacked any ability to create innovation and that they brought with them innovation and, the modernity that allowed us to be where we are today. But the reality is we are now stuck. And it is our knowledge systems, our ways of being that they are now trying to co-opt and pervert into commodified capitalist solutions. And we have to take that stand and fight as much as we can so that we can end these systems and structures and bring back and rematriate our cultures, our identities, our ways of being through pushing for sovereignty and self-determination and utilizing some of the tools that our ancestors fought for, including things like the UN Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples and the maintaining of our culture and Indigenous knowledge systems and our inherent Indigenous rights. Daniel's going to be talking about that later. I know Francois is going to be talking about that later in keynotes. I think these are really important things to understand, that our fights and making governments spend their money is not for nothing. It is for our future generations.